Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name is Lea Beliaeva, and today we're talking about Catalan modernist painters. Modernism is one of the most significant art movements in Catalonia, one that played a crucial role in shaping the cultural identity of Catalonia at the turn of the 20th century, while also drawing inspiration from other artistic trends across Europe. On today's podcast, we will delve into this pivotal art movement, exploring its defining characteristics and highlighting its most influential artists. We will also hear from an art historian who will shed light on the notable absence of women in this movement and how the landscape of art has evolved today. I'm joined by Emma Monrós. Welcome, Emma.
Hi, how are you?
Long time no see.
Yes.
I'm glad to have you back. So in Catalonia, the modernist art movement and the modernist painters, they are well known, but this might not be the case for all of our listeners. So can you explain just in general terms what modernism is?
Well, as you've mentioned, modernism is one of the most important art movements in the history of Catalonia because it has had a lot of implications beyond art. So like in the Catalan history and Catalans' everyday life. This trend was born as an idea that the Catalan culture could no longer be like the regional adaptation of the art movement that was going on in Spain or in other countries in Europe. So the idea that Catalonia needed its own identity in the art scene.
And I might add that Catalonia tried to look more towards Europe and not so much towards the Spanish peninsula.
Yeah, it looked a lot into France, which we will get into later.
And all of this, it took place in the last decades of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, right?
Yeah, and in Catalonia, the beginning of modernism, el modernisme, is always marked by the 1888 Universal Exposition that took place in Barcelona. But in general, experts say that modernism goes from the last decade of the 19th century to the first decade of the 20th century.
But as I mentioned before, this wasn't only a Catalan phenomenon. Modernism in general was just everywhere. It was all the rage all over Europe.
Yes, modernism in the Western world in general was an art movement that was boosted by the new reigning social class, the bourgeoisie, because at the time they did not have their own art style, so the idea was to move away from traditional painting techniques and create something modern, hence the name.
And we will get into the details of these techniques a little bit later. And this trend, it had different names, right?
Exactly. So in France, it's Art Nouveau. In Germany, it would be Jugendstil.
Jugendstil.
Exactly. Also in Germany and other Nordic countries. Secession in Austria, probably not pronounced like that, I'm sorry. And in Anglo-Saxon countries, it was called modern style.
And here in Catalonia, the form of modernism that we know the most is in architecture, basically.
Exactly.
And if you have listened to previous episodes of Filling the Sink, the name Lluís Domènech i Muntaner, it might ring a bell because he is the father of Catalan modernist architecture.
And other names that might ring a bell, which were Domènech i Muntaner's disciples, were Puig i Cadafalch and obviously Antoni Gaudí.
Of course.
And basically all these architectures brought new radical constructions and they were on the street so everyone could see them. Maybe that's why one of the reasons why it has so much importance. And at the time, it also had a lot of influence on international architecture.
But today we are talking about painting. So in this wave of modernism or Art Nouveau or Jugendstil, how did it all come to Catalonia?
So it came to Catalonia mainly through two painters that are considered the most important modernists in Catalonia, which are Ramon Casas and Santiago Rusiñol. They had been living and painting in Paris during Impressionism, which they brought back to Catalonia and adapted to the context.
Yeah, and this context was the Escola Luminista de Sitges, and they worked a lot with lighting, and they had this radical idea at the time of taking the canvases out of the studios, outdoors, and painting landscapes and everyday life, and not memorizing the objects as they did before. And before we mentioned this moving away from traditional painting techniques and into something modern. And the art critic Ramon Casas, who supported the modernist movement, he defined just how to do that.
Yes, basically to use modern techniques.
Okay, that's very, very specific. What does that really entail?
Some of these techniques meant that light would have more protagonism in the paintings, and light was also used to capture the atmosphere. In addition, different moments of the day were captured, and it also had loose and soft brushstrokes, so making the painting have like an unfinished look, but it was actually finished.
Yeah, so that was a huge change from the painting methods before modernism and impressionism. And then there were also the colors.
Yes, first the Impressionists and then the Modernists didn't use the color black to create shadows, so they used blues or other complementary colors, and that created brighter paintings because there was no black.
Wow, I think that's really something that when you look at modernist artworks, then you can really tell the difference. You can tell how they use these bluer tones. I find that really like a fascinating detail about it. And many of these paintings can be seen at the National Art Museum of Catalonia, or to many known as El Menac, in Barcelona. And the motifs, you said something about everyday scenes.
Yes, so these scenes of like everyday, maybe staring at a window, reading a book, like a family scene, they were really typical of the modernist movement. Then there were also landscapes, as you mentioned, because they wanted to like just go outdoors and do what was actually there. And nature was really important. It was painted from a lot of perspective, and very different elements of nature were painted. And there were also a lot of graphic art that were starting to get more importance on the art scene. And finally, there were a lot of portraits and female figures.
The female figure. So basically, the women were in the paintings, but did they also paint themselves?
We talked to Elina Norandi, who is an art historian and art critic, about it, and she will tell us more. Are there any women artists in Catalan modernism?
Tenim a Catalunya dones artistes que treballen en aquesta època del modernisme.
There were women artists working in this period of modernism in Catalonia. However, traditionally they have never been studied. What I always say is that it is not that there are no women artists, it's just that art history did not want to work on them. It is one of the thousands of strategies that the patriarchy uses to omit, to not give importance, and to undervalue women's art. However, there was a magazine in Catalonia that did publish stories about female artists and what was called Women's Matters in general. Elina explains that Feminal is a magazine that was inspired by others that already existed in Paris. It was not only about women's topics like fashion or cooking recipes. This magazine spoke about topics of all kinds.
I Feminal comença a sortir com un suplement.
Feminal was sold as a supplement of a great magazine at the time, Ilustració Catalana, Catalan Illustration, which meant that if the man bought the magazine, the wife got the supplement. Feminal was created for bourgeoisie Catholic women, and it had this clear ideological view. These are women who constantly say throughout the magazine that a woman's fundamental role is to be a woman and a wife. We find in Feminal that frequently an article is done from a female artist studio with pictures of her and her artwork. This is like a treasure trove because most of these artists are now completely unknown, and we know of them because of the magazine. They are all women born in the second half of the 19th century, and their moment as artists was until the start of World War I. In addition, a lot of the women who appear in Feminal were young and had studied in La Llotja, an art academy in Barcelona. But a lot of them, once they married, left their art behind because their husbands barred them from painting or sculpting or whatever their art form was.
O dedicar-se a l'escultura o el que fos.
Despite being published in a magazine, at the time, this is all we know about some of these women artists.
La meva teoria...
My theory is that we know of the women that we do because their careers were professionalized. Why? Because they opted for not marrying or not having children. Sadly, in that time, women still had to choose. Either you were a woman who worked or you were a mother. Lola Anglada states this clearly in her memoirs. I had to choose. If I wanted to dedicate my whole life to my paintings and my art, I could not get married. She went to Paris and studied there, as did Lluïsa Vidal. These women were lucky enough to, on one side, have a family, a father who did not have any problems with these women working on art, and because they chose not to marry. And this is why we have a lot of their work, and we can see some in museums or collections because they took care of their work themselves.
Jo crec que gràcies a la historiografia.
I think that thanks to feminist historiography, we can now recover some of women's artists, while other women's work, I think, is lost forever. I think it is really difficult because also the canon of Catalan modernism has been built according to the great names of Catalan painters, which are now displayed in rooms in the National Art Museum of Catalonia and other amazing museums. But the canon is that. I think it would be really difficult now to change that, but I think and I hope that we will get to that point, although there's still a long way to go.
Espero, jo penso que sí, que arribarem a aquest punt.
Thanks to Elina Norandi for speaking with us. So Elina mentioned a few Catalan modernist female artists, but where can we actually see their works?
There's actually not a lot of work of these women to see. Some of them you can find in museums in Catalonia, and some of them are in the museums, but they are not displayed on the rooms. They are just property of the museums, but they are not for people to see.
And why?
Well, they don't consider that the artists have enough of a name to be displayed, or maybe it just doesn't go with the other paintings in the room. But some of the women you can actually see. The main one is Lluïsa Vidal. She mainly did self-portraits, or that's what she's more known for. But she also did portraits of family members and friends, as well as everyday life scenes. You can find her work at Manac.
And then there was also Pepita Tejido, who was different from Lluïsa Vidal because she mainly painted flowers. But she also did a few portraits, and her work can also be seen at Manac.
Exactly. And another artist that can also be seen at Manac, or they have their work at Manac, is Maria Luisa Way, so from the Way family. And some of her work is also in Cantabria, in Palacio de Comillas.
Okay, so outside of Catalonia.
Yes. So this thing about having these art pieces not on display, it's not only a thing that happens in Catalonia, it's everywhere. When Elina was creating the exposition for Feminal, she contacted Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and she asked for a specific painting from an author that was presented in the magazine. And when she asked for this painting, Musée d'Orsay replied back to Elina, congratulating her, because no one had ever asked for that painting that was just there.
So there are basically two problems. One is that there are very few female artists. They are in storage. But then it also has something to do with the quality of the art, right?
Yeah, when talking with Elina, she also mentioned that the women maybe were not good or not as good as the men, because at the time they did not have access to the same art lessons. So they were generally taught how to paint flowers, and it was quite limited to that, whereas the men were taught how to paint almost everything. Like they could go out and paint landscapes. They could paint bodies because they could see naked bodies, while it was not proper for women, young women, to see naked bodies and to actually paint them. So some of the reasons to not have women in the museums, it's also because the paintings maybe weren't as good because they couldn't be.
So that is the context that we also have to keep in mind when we talk about the lack of female artists, that
Exactly.
the few there were didn't have the same opportunities. And one of the Catalan female artists that we mentioned before, Lluïsa Vidal, who you talked to Elina about, she was actually a great painter with a very good technique. And the funny thing about Lluïsa Vidal is that at the time, she was heavily criticized for her paintings because it was thought that her paintings were too masculine. And what does that mean? It means that she painted these motifs that you just talked about, Emma, that were at the time only reserved for men, like portraits, landscapes, everything beyond flowers, basically. But luckily, times have changed, and there are a lot more female artists in Catalonia.
Exactly. I brought a list of some contemporary Catalan women artists of different genres and different styles, so there's a little bit for everyone. The first one I want to present is Maria Corte. She's from Barcelona, And she says that her illustrations are dominated by an interest in disrupting the space with geometric shapes.
Interesting. Another one is Malika Fabra, who is French but based in Barcelona, and people may know her because she did the La Merced poster in 2021.
It's personally one of my favorites from the last years. And she has also done some work from the New York Times, the Washington Post, Vogue Spain, and many other publications. We also have Rosa Aguiló Miquel, who is a painter from Girona. She draws moments, some of which are transcendental and some of which are insignificant, like Modernism did at the time.
Indeed.
And lastly, we have Regina Jiménez from Barcelona, whose work explores colors and geometrical shapes in an abstract wall. And apart from her painting, she also does collages on textiles and photography.
Okay, so a few recommendations of Catalan female artists. And now it's time for the Catalan phrase of the week. Emma, enlighten us.
So the Catalan phrase is una flor no fa estiu ni dues primavera, which would translate to one swallow does not make a summer, which means that basically just because something happens once or twice doesn't mean that it has to be the norm.
And we chose this Catalan phrase because a lot of female Catalan modernist artists used to paint flowers.
Yes, and on my talk with Elina, she mentioned that it shouldn't be something looked down on, that women only painted flowers. It was the only thing they could paint, so they chose to still paint, even though if it was just that.
And they did it well too.
Exactly.
And that's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcast if you haven't already. Thanks again to Elina Norandi for speaking with us. Thanks to you, Emma.
Thank you.
And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Filling the Sink. On behalf of the team here at Catalan News, I'm Lea Beliaeva, wishing you a great weekend. Fins aviat. Adeu.